Basically, we're going to see really rather boring pictures. It happens that they're female, but the male at the same time, if we'd have shown male, it would have been exactly the same. What is interesting about that period is the way that they are completely separated. The whole of that period. We're talking from, I'm not going quite as early as that, but let's say from the 18th century up until 1920. It was quite extraordinary when you look at it, when you remember what was happening in the art world. I mean, forget Impressionism, not mentioned. Cubism, not mentioned. Fauvism, not known. In 1920, it was as if the whole of that lot had not happened. We were completely separated in the way that we've now separated ourselves from Europe. There's nothing different about it. Anyway, let's have a look at the first two. Now, what the artists decided to do, there was no way to show their work. So they got together and they decided to make a sort of a place.
Have some tea, Pat.
Yes, my voice is going a bit funny, isn't it? And they decided to get themselves together, and they decided on the Royal Academy. And in 1768, 35 artists decided that they wanted somewhere specifically to show every year. And so they created the Royal Academy. And they only included 2 women. Now, the really fascinating thing is we're going to see this whole business together, and it's going to take 150 years before they allow women to come in again. Isn't that amazing? Now, the pictures we're looking at the moment about one of the women who they agreed to at this particular time to join, and her name is Angelica Kaufmann. She was German, but she worked a lot in England. And she was born in 1741. She died in 1807. And these 2 strange objects here, the one on the left is the name is invention. The one on the right is color. Now these were created specifically for the sealing of the newly formed Royal Academy. And she and a woman called Mary Moser were the only 2 women who were invited to join. And so in 1768, this is what happened. And so the Society of the Arts was established much earlier. That was established in 1754. But this is the first time they had a sort of public place to show their work. Let's put the next 2 on, and I'll show you what happened from that. Now, this is quite interesting. It tells you see here. The Academy's first president, Joshua Reynolds, you see. And you see they signed a petition to seek royal permission to establish society for promoting the arts of design.
You want to clear your throat?
I don't know what's wrong with it. Okay, next one. I'm going to have to. Now, this is a fascinating picture. This is by Zoffany. Now, Zoffany again was a German artist, working mostly as a portraitist in England. Worked in Italy, and surprisingly in India, because at this point we'd established ourselves in India. And this particular picture is the painting of the I can't say it, academicians. Isn't that funny? I couldn't say it. Of the Royal Academy, actually preparing to embark on a life class. And so this is why you see these 2 nude men. No women at all. Look at something interesting. To show the fact that there were 2 women in the original Royal Academy, their portraits are on the wall. And there is Kaufmann and there is Moser. But all the rest, all the men. And these are the 35 original members. And of course, you see the plaster casts and so on, which are still in the Royal Academy situation. And that's interesting. I haven't actually been able to identify who they were. But the next one will show you the work of Mary Moser. Now, they say that the reason that she was included, it was because her father was a member of the original, one of the original members. As you see, he was a Swiss man. and his name was George Michael Mercer. And they think they allowed, this is what they think, that they allowed her in because of her father. She was basically a portrait painter. This is a detail of that. She virtually did only portraits. She was born in 1714, so very much the same age as Kaufman, and she died in 1819. And this picture is called Spring, and she was basically a flower painter. Okay, next one. Now, this is the series of self-portraits. These are interesting for one reason. It's Joshua Reynolds, who was the first president, of course, and the most important of them all. But interestingly, this particular painting that he did of self-portrait is based entirely on a Rembrandt, which I think is now in New York, which shows Rembrandt's self-portrait with a bust, I think, of Julius Caesar on the side, and of course based entirely. Now, the one in the center, this was Angelica Kaufmann's self-portrait. She was really rather an attractive woman, wasn't she? These are both 1775, there or enough. Now, the one on the extreme right was not a self-portrait, but it's a portrait of Mary Mercer by in fact, George Romney. You know, he was the same period of them, born in 70, he died in 1802. But this particular one is 1780, the other two are 1775. I think it's a very interesting self-portrait, very softly painted. It reminded me enormously of Gainsborough, actually. But she's showing herself, you see, in her hand. She's got her brush and her palette. Okay, next one. Now, these I think are very interesting. Shows you how good Reynolds really was. I think the picture on the left is one of the most interesting. Now, this was a fascinating thing. It shows you, so it's in fact, it's quite interesting politically, because this is the first time anybody painted anybody from one of the countries that we had literally taken over. This is the first time he actually came from Polynesia. He was called Beer, and he was brought over by Captain Cook. I think this is interesting. It's a lovely painting. I've seen this one. It's very big. It's 1774, and he was called Orsay. That's all I know about him, Orsai. But this was the first time an artist painted a portrait of a man of color. And interestingly, you see, he's put the landscape of what he imagines Polynesia to be behind him. Now, the one on the right, this is in Dulwich, or one of them is in Dulwich. He did actually two. And this is Mrs. Siddons as the tragic muse. And it's very interesting. It's very big paintings. It works very well. And she's dressed up in costume, and she's got a sort of crown on her head. She's for the tragic muse, and the back of her is an episode of Hamlet, and there she is sitting there. She's Mrs. Siddons. This is in fact around about 1783. Okay, the next one is interesting because we've lost the portrait. This is fascinating because it's the first time we see, in fact, it's the only time we see a portrait by Reynolds' sister. Frances Reynolds, he taught Frances Reynolds, his sister, to paint, but she became his housekeeper. And as far as I know, this is the only one they've ever found which survives of her work. Now, they're both, this is the same woman. She's actually called Elizabeth Montagu. She was a very important salon hostess at the time. She's a great Shakespearean. She knew a great deal about Shakespeare, and she used to discuss, they should have these great salons, which were actors and intellectuals would go. And the painting that Reynolds did of her is now lost, and all that's left is the engraving after the painting. And what they say in the book, which is quite true, is Reynolds has made her much sort of younger and prettier than Frances. It turns out that Frances and Elizabeth Montagu became friends. And there's a wonderful quotation from Francis Montague saying to Elizabeth Montagu, saying to Francis, "For goodness sake, don't make me look like a girl. Paint me the age I am," which I think is really rather sweet. It's rather a nice painting, actually, and that's the only painting that I think we know of her work. It was painted in 1778, and she was a very important Shakespearean scholar. Okay, now at the same time in England, there was the work of Artemisia Gentileschi. Now, the scandal of the picture on the left, which is Susanna and the Elders, was that it was owned by the royal family, and it was discovered in a cupboard under the stairs or something quite recently. That was only actually shown to the public in 1970. And this one, we'll see another example of Susanna of the Elders. This was actually painted moderately late. She was born in 1638. She died in 1648. And this particular one was painted in about 1630. Now, on the right, the top, what I omitted to tell you, we're in the sort of the neoclassical age. And in order to be taken seriously, the subject matter of the paintings, if they were portraits and so on, had to be from a classical background. And the top one is Kaufmann. And in fact, they're both Kaufmann. This is the return of a Telemach from Virgil, 1775. And this is Andromeda fainting at the unexpected sight of Aeneas at the same time. Both of them are from Virgil. And this is the kind of thing that one had to, at the time, to paint if you were not painting portraits. But have a good look at the Artemisia, because it's a bloody good painting. Next one will show you the same subject matter, but much, much earlier. And this, of course, is the self-portrait. Now, again, the self-portrait is actually at the Queen's house. This one has been seen. It's actually self-portrait as an allegory of painting. And this is 1638. And this particular Susanna of the Elders, which was much earlier than the other one, this is 1610. And it's an extraordinary painting. It doesn't look as if it's painted by the same person, but it is. And she was, the story of Susanna was really popular at this particular time because it was supposed to be an example of virtue, the woman behaving in a virtuous manner. Have a good look at the self-portrait. It's bloody good. Look at the palette in the front here, and this marvelous shape of her painting at the top. It's a splendid piece of painting. This is, I say, 1638. Now, the next person I'd never heard of before, and she was called Anne Killigrew, and here are the examples. This is tells you about her. But she was very spread. She was a poet as well, and here is an example of one of her poets. One thinks of Gainsborough, I suppose, a bit. The one on the left, it's rather extraordinary. It's Venus attired by the three Graces, and this is much earlier. This is 1680, and this one at the top here is also this lady called Killigrew, and it's Lady as Venus mourning for Adonis, and this is about 1680. The poems are about 1686, and you see the interesting thing is, remember that these women had no ability at all to paint from the model. I mean, they had to paint themselves really, because they didn't have the same training as men at the time at all. And the figure of Venus is a bit strange, I think. But the landscape is really very nice. And the strange little Cupid in the top is rather interesting. Okay, next one. Now, this is another lady I'd never heard of. She's called Joan Carlyle. She was born in 1686 and she died in 1606. and she died in 1679. Now, again, they say unknown woman, but if you look at it, it says very clearly, Lady Elizabeth Murray, Countess of Dysart, and the Duchess of Lauderdale. What is interesting, the one on the extreme right is by Van Dyck. Now, Van Dyck was slightly earlier. He was born in 1809. Sorry, he was born in 1509. He died in 1599. He's just before. And he was an Antwerp. He was an Antwerp painter who came to work for Charles I in England. And this particular one is 1641. I've put them on because there's no doubt that this Joan Carlyle was looking at the way he was painting satin. Look at the way that the satin of both of these two are really very impressive. But I didn't know anything more about her. But she was, by all accounts, the first woman in England to try to build up a professional career. And she lived with her husband. I didn't know, but at the time, Covent Garden was the centre of the artistic centre of London. And she lived with her husband, also a painter. And she was, in fact, a professional artist. And she paid money for it. Okay, next one. Now, this lady, I think, is awfully good. She's called Mary Beer. And I think she's a very serious artist. She was she's again a 17th century lady. She was born in 1633. She died in 1699. But she's really very impressive. And she was a very successful painter. She lived in Pall Mall in her case. And the picture in the center here is a self-portrait. But what is fascinating are those picture above, or those her painting of her two sons. And there's 1660. And this is one of her commissions. And I think this is really rather sweet at the time. This is Jane Fox, Lady Lee, as a shepherdess. And look, you see the sheep, a rather strange looking sheep, and a sort of, I suppose, a plant or something she's giving to the sheep, and this strange object, a crook, I suppose, in her hand. Now, the picture on the extreme right, just to show you the kind of portrait painter of the time, that's Peter Lely. And this particular one is the Countess of Leith. He was born in 1618. He died, it was exactly the same time. He died in 1680. And he was a court painter. He was knighted and very, very, very interesting. I mean, he was the painter of the royal family. Now, this Mary Beale was able, and this isn't something that we'll discover about all of them. These ladies could only even think about painting if they were married to somebody suitable and who, in fact, could afford to keep them, because her husband had really rather high position. He was a clerk of the Royal Patent Office, and so she had no real need to become a professional painter, but she was. I think the self-portrait is interesting. She's not showing herself, you notice this time, as a painter. She's showing herself really as rather, again, remember that it's classical. Look at the classical pot and the classical pillar behind her. We're talking about the neoclassical period. Okay, next one. Now, these are interesting. They're not oil paints. These are the first time we see pastel used. And there is no doubt about it that this lady was very interesting. She says she was trained by Quentin Latour. And this is a self-portrait of him. He's a Frenchman, very successful. Pastel was first started in Italy, in Rome, and he was the first Frenchman to use it. And that's pastel. And it's a self-portrait with a lace jabot, 1751. And this lady, Catherine Reed, always said that she was trained by him. he denied this flatly. But it's interesting because this is the first pastoralist we know in this country. And the one I think is charming on the left, it's Miss Helena Beatonstone, and this is 1767. And it's pastel on paper, and you see her drawing. It sees the little girl drawing herself. The ones in the middle are portrait of George Earl Euston and Lady George Fitzroy with their dog. And this is very interesting, really. Again, she said, you know, she was professional in the sense that we do have a few of her work. Both of these two belong to her. This is in the exhibition. Okay, next one. That one was painted by, photographed by Camilla, of course, you're going to see by the frame. Now, this is another interesting woman. Now, she's not English. All the others, but the ones we've looked at were English. This woman is called Maria Verlist, and she came again from the Netherlands. And she came to work in England, and she painted in England. Very, very famous at the time for painting this incredible blue velvet, which she did all the time. We've moved up a bit. This is 1723. She came to England. She worked in England. She was born at, although she was never there. She was born in Vienna, and she came to England in the 1720s, and she died here in England. The one on the right is one of hers, and it's late. The reason I put it on because it's Lady Diana Spencer, the Duchess of Marlborough of the 1690s, and she had many. She was a very successful painter. She painted actually women. There are no male pictures by her at all in existence. But again, you see the neoclassical background. But this one is becoming a little more romantic. We're moving faintly into the romantic period now. Okay, next one. Now, this I think is very fun. This one is very strange. This lady she was a professional artist. She lived actually again in the Covent Garden area. She was married to a painter, and she exhibited with the Society of the Artists in 1765, and she was obviously made a lot of money because she put her money into property, and she owned quite a lot of property. The self-portrait, she sits there very firmly, and she, as an artist, and this is 1785, and she's called Mary Black. And she actually painted this gentleman on the right, and he's called Messenger Moncey, and this was painted in 1764. That's the only really well-known painting left of her. But what is fascinating is that what is left is a letter. He was a sort of a famous physician at the time, and she painted him, and then she sent him a bill, and he was furious because he said that he had no intention of paying her, and so he referred to her as a slut for daring to send a bill to him. And so I think this is quite funny. But she became, in the end, this caused a bit of a scandal, and she didn't get any more work, so she became a teacher. But she's interesting. This is the only self-portrait we know. But notice, you see, she's very, very firmly showing her that she sees herself as an artist. Okay, next one. And we're moving up a bit. This is very strange. This is a huge picture in the exhibition. I was absolutely amazed at this. This is by a woman called Maria Cosway, and she was born in 1760, and she died in 1838. So we're beginning now to get a little bit to the 19th century. And this particular, I think this is very strange as a commission, because she's the Duchess of Devonshire, but she's chosen to have herself painted as Cynthia, the moon goddess. And you see in her head the diadem around her head, and she is shaped like a moon. It's a very, very large picture, huge. She was very successful. Maria Cosway became so successful that Queen Adelaide sort of made her her court painter. And this particular picture on the right is the Princess of Wales with her daughter, Princess Charlotte, and that was painted in 1801. And again, you see the figure of a classical figure behind her. But in fact, I think this is possibly London in this way. And it should see it's got here, this is a royal picture. The other one, she was actually, Maria Cosway was unique in that she was trained in Florence. Her parents had a business in Florence, and so she was brought up in Florence. And so she really was very well trained. And she became very successful. She had a sort of a salon, and she was very much involved with the musical society at the time. And so people used to go and stay with her. A very, very important person. She was, in fact, herself a musician. Okay, next one. Now, this is very strange. This lady is Margaret Sarah Carpenter. But I put on the left a contemporary, male contemporary. This is Thomas Lawrence, who again became president of the Royal Academy. And I think it's such a strange picture. It's Maria II. She's the Queen of Portugal. And look at the poor woman with all this stuff around her hair. The one in the center is this Margaret Sarah Carpenter. And she was very successful portrait painter, but she was not allowed to become a member of the Royal Academy. And she used to show at the Royal Academy every year. And she always sold everything. She was very successful. The middle one, she's the Countess of Howe, and that was painted in 1834. But look at the Holy Family. It's really a very nice painting. Particularly the children, I think, were extraordinarily well done. That's 1825. And she was incredibly successful. And she became, she took over when Thomas Lawrence died, she took over a lot of his clients. She was successful. She made money. Okay, next one. Now we've come back to what Camilla and I thought was the most interesting part of the exhibition. And these were basically watercolors. We start with the lady who was the first Royal Academician. This is Mary Mercer, and it's Flowers in a Vase, and it's 1759, but it's watercolor. But the one on the right is absolutely wonderful. She was called Mary Delaney. Now, astonishingly, this is collage. These flowers, all of this is from cut-out paper. It wasn't this amazing, Camilla, this one.
Incredibly delicate.
It was so delicate. And you see, it's got the interesting thing about the ones we're coming to, was that they were used by the botanists at the time. There was a big an interest, a sudden interest in botany. And you notice the name of the plant here. It's Rubus odoratus of course in Latin. And it was painted, it was cut in 1772 to 1780. And it's a collage. It was quite beautiful, wasn't it, Camilla? So delicate. And on a black ground. This is a reflection on the side. Now, the next one is even more extraordinary. Look at these. These are cut out paper. They were so beautiful. Look how delicate. Look at the way she's described space. The stamens in the front of this petals as they're coming down. Beautiful piece of work. We were deeply impressed with this. This was called Crinium Asiaticus. This is again 1780. there's a detail, of course, this is a detail of that. Again, black ink at the background. But they really were so extraordinarily delicate. Okay, next one. This is again. This is another woman. There's another woman. She's called Augustus Innes Withers, and she again was the flower painter to Queen Adelaide. She was born in 1792 and so 1877. And this particular one here was very, very special, really. And again, it's an auricula in a pot. And she says, with a wicker cachet pot. Oh, again, watercolor. These watercolors are so extraordinary. And I think this one here is wonderful. This is another lady, slightly later, Helen Cordelia Angel. And this is a hedge sparrow nest and with hawthorn. And look at those eggs, aren't they splendid?
Mm. Again, the level of detail was microscopic.
And look at the way, again, the way that these are watercolor. Look at the way she's described space inside that nest. And you know the fact that the nest is in front of these plants at the back. They're very, very beautiful. These were the things we liked best of all in the exhibition. Okay, next one. These are just extraordinary. I should really, Camilla did all sorts of lovely details, which I should have put on because they were just amazing. This is the same lady, Augustus Innes Withers, but the gooseberry was 1825, and again it's watercolor. Look at them, and look at the half of the gooseberry there. Again, I'm so impressed at the way she gives you the sense of space of the plant. And the one on the right is the cannonball muscat grape. Beautifully painted. These two are the same as the lady who did the one just before. But the next one on the other side is a different woman. She's called Martha Harley Morris. And this is an oil painting. These are watercolor, and this is an oil painting. But again, extraordinary. They had it's called Wildflowers in the Corner of a Cornfield. And that's roughly the same, a little bit later. This is 1855, and the other ones are about 1830, 1826 to 30. Beautiful things, these. Now we're going to see next, we're moving a little bit into the 19th century, and I've deliberately put on Turner, Range, Steam and Speed, because there's no doubt that Turner was the most important, perhaps the great one, together with Constable, the two great painters, English painters. But this lady was called Barbara Lee Bodethon, Bodethon, and she was a very serious watercolorist. And she was actually, eventually, she was employed at Girton College in Cambridge, and to teach the students watercolor. And the one on the right, this is she on the right, and it's the view from my window in Snowdonia in the 1850s. And she was so popular that her work was sent to America, where she was shown in America. And it's quite incredibly the detail is very worth looking at. It's extraordinary detail. It's a nice painting, this, wasn't it? We enjoyed this one.
The scale of it, if I remember, was quite big.
It was very big. Yes, it was very big.
It sort of reminded us of the early landscape paintings. I mean, they were romantic depictions of the U.S. landscape. Sort of the mountains, the waterfalls.
Surprisingly, she did show in America, interestingly.
Yeah. They kind of had that same
They
like
did have that
cinematic
same, yeah.
grandiosity about it.
Now, the next one is slightly interesting. Now, the picture on the left, I had this the marble head is by the first and only colored lady. She was a black woman, and she was called Euthymia Lewis. She was born in 1844. She died in 1907. And this is the bust of Christ in marble at 1870. It's very 19th century, I mean, but it's an extraordinary piece of work. Now, the other two on the left, again, they're the first. This is the first Jewish lady who known painter. She's called Rebecca Solomon. Now, she had two brothers who were successful Victorian painters, and possibly she showed with them. This is the reason she was able to show. You see, none of these people, it was very difficult for them to show. They showed more or less every year at the Royal Academy, but they were never made, as I said, for another 150 years, they were never made Royal Academicians. They just showed in it. Now, she was born in 1832. She died in 66. And her brothers were called Abraham and Simeon, and they were much better known. But the actual picture in the center tells us a lot about the society of the time. It's called The Young Reader, the Young Teacher. And the little girl is telling the Indian servant, teaching the Indian servant how to read. And the one on the right has got an even more interesting title. It's called Sherry Sir, and it's 1858 to 62. It's a nice painting, this, I think. And the pictures on the back are engravings. It's a very interesting one. She's good, I think. Now, this is really perhaps the most successful woman painter that we know. We really all still know. And she, of course, is French. And this, of course, is Rosa Bonheur. And she was born in 1822 and 1899. And she was internationally known. She came to England. The Queen asked her to come. She was sent to Scotland to paint in Scotland. And this is the sheep, I presume the royal sheep or something. It's the sheep of the Highlands, and it's 1857. She was totally internationally known. And I just think the detail is very interesting. You can see how confident she is. Look at that extraordinary painting. It's very large, this one. Now I'm going to show you two pictures again, which is about war. And the difference is the male attitude to war and the female attitude to war. I've deliberately chosen Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People of 1836, which was tremendously well known. Of course, he was immensely popular. The self-portrait there is at the same year, is 1837. And this extraordinary triumph of the spirit of France leading the men, the violence. Look at the death. The whole thing is about violence. And then I'm going to put this extraordinary picture of this lady, the next one. It's so interesting. She was called Lady Elizabeth Butler, and this was 1833. And we've said the other one was the same time. Now look at the difference of the way the female looks at war and the way a male does. This is actually this is actually the battle. It was the Battle of Inkerman. It actually happened 20 years before this. And this is all about, these are the Grenadier Guards. It's called the Roll Call. And it was painted in 1874. The actual Inkerman battle was in 1854. And of course, it was a true story. It was, of course, the British, but look at the difference. This is showing you the results the terrible results of the engagement of the Crimean War. And she was absolutely amazing. She actually was very successful, and she initiated her own school in Kensington, and she was very, very successful. But I'm going to show you the detail just to show you the next one. Look at this. Now look at these people, look at this carefully, because look at the way she's individually, these soldiers are all individual portraits. Look at their faces, every single one of them. Look at them, and they're all wounded in some way or another. It's not the triumph of the battle, it's the results of the battle, with the fallen man in the front. And this is a self-portrait. I think she's very interesting. It was enormous, wasn't it? We really were impressed with her. Now, this is a funny one. This lady, Florence Classen, it's rather she's sending it up a bit. It's called a medley, as you see. And she was, as you see, she was first organized movement for women's rights. And this woman's work satirizes, as they point out, the opportunity. You see at the centre a group of women fawn at the feet of a man seated below a statue of the golden calf, a false idol. It's just that it's an interesting criticism of the situation of women at the time. Okay, next one. Now this one, of course, we know very well. This is Ford Madox Brown. Now, why have I put the Ford Madox Brown on? Because surprisingly, he was a sort of a slightly second level pre-Raphaelite, tremendously important figure of the time. But what is interesting about him, so interesting about him, is that he taught virtually all the women we're now going to be looking at. And this particular one is work. And I've deliberately chosen it to show that the difference in the subject matter. We are now in the middle of the 19th century. This is 1852. And if you look at this carefully, he shows you the entire group, the class group of England or London at the time. This, of course, is Hampstead. You know, it's Hampstead High Street. And you see the beggar man, the worker, the wealthy on horseback, and the workers here, and here the thinkers looking on at this thing. But the one on the right, we saw her photograph of her. We saw her last week. She was photographed by Cameron. She's Mary Bartelli. She was the daughter of a wealthy Greek, and she married an American painter called Stillman. So this is Mary Bartelli Stillman, and it's a self-portrait. Now I want you to look at this carefully, because you could see not only she was actually taught by Ford Madox Brown, but she's been looking, of course, at Whistler. This is very Whistlerian, this background here. Very, very, it's a beautiful portrait. It's a self-portrait. It's 1894. She was really very much later part of the 19th century than this one. Okay, next one. But he did teach her. He taught these people too. This one is absolutely typical 19th century picture, and she is called Emily Osborne. And it's called Nameless and Friendless, and it's about poverty. It says, the quotation, rich man's wealth, but in a poor city. And of course, she's bringing either her own work to be sold, and the little boy is with her. Now, the interesting thing about the center one is, and it was extremely criticized because it was considered extremely bad taste. It's actually by a woman called Anna Lee Merritt, and it's Love Locked Out of 1890. But the important thing is it's a nude, and it's a nude boy. And this is the first time we see a woman painting a nude. The one on the right, of course, is extremely pre-Raphaelite. It's actually Evelyn de Morgan, and it's called The Martyr. But it does look entirely like a pre-Raphaelite one. And she also she usually painted these sort of classical subjects, and she actually she exhibited. Now we've got the idea of gallery of public exhibition, and the gallery. She was at the Grosvenor Gallery, and which is unusual for a woman. And at the same time, she became sort of part of what was latterly called the aesthetic movement. But interesting, very pre-Raphaelite, really. Okay, next one. And this woman, I think, was very interesting. She's somebody we really ought to know. She's called Louise Jopling, and this is a self-portrait. I want to show it's a very nice one because it's a self-portrait actually looking through. It says, through the looking glass. Can you see she's painting herself in the mirror here? But the actual paint quality, it was actually painted in 1875. And the paint quality is the first time we get a sense of what was happening in France, because the actual method of applying the brush is very much like Impressionism. And of course, the time is right. All of these people, incidentally, knew about French art because they'd all been in Paris at some point or another. She was born in 1843. She died in 1933. But she's a very interesting woman because she started her own art school in the 1880s. And she really was very successful. The picture on the right is her too. The one in the center, of course, is Whistler. I've put this one Whistler on because Whistler at the time was probably the only international figure that they all looked at. And this is, of course, the white girl of 1861. But she was trained, Louise Jopley was trained in Paris, and she exhibited in the Paris Salon, actually. And she showed her work at a dealer's, Avenues. Now, the picture on the right was very, very heavily criticized. It's called, it was one of her pictures, it's 1875, it's a modern Cinderella. But she was criticized because it was very, very rude to show a naked shoulder, the naked shoulder here. It's a good piece of painting, actually. It's interesting she's used a mirror again. It's interesting the way she's dealt with space here. She's an interesting woman. The next one shows you her school. This is her school, which was in Kensington. And she was successful. She included, she had a sort of salon, and in her salon, you know, you could see Oscar Wilde and Whistler. She really knew what was going on. And this is one of her sketches on the right. Again, it's the 1880s. And she was very well known. And here she's showing her students, look at the clothes, her students, how to paint. And of course, dressed, not nude. It looks a bit squashed, doesn't it? They don't look at that in a lot of room. No. Okay, it's very interesting because here we get something which is much more typically sort of, as we think about in Victorian art. And here we've got, she's called Elizabeth Forbes, and she was born in Canada, this girl. She came to England. Now, why these two are interesting, I put them together, is that they got together and they moved from London to Cornwall, and they started a group of artists called the Newland School, which became very successful and very popular. And this lady on the left is Sarah Satchel, and this one is Elizabeth Forbes. Both of these did this, and they were I don't know. This is based on a poem. The picture is based on a poem. It's called The Momentous Question, and it is a poem about smugglers. And this was a sort of illustration. But this one, I think, is rather more interesting. And this is obviously a country school of the time. This is 1889, and the other one, the sexual is 1850. Okay, next one. Now we have here a really interesting group, because this is the wife of Lawrence Alma Tadema. Now, Alma Tadema is very, very successful artist of the time, and he seems to be involved with all of the people we're going to be talking about. This is picture. This is Lawrence Alma Tadema, picture of his wife, Laura. And this is the looking at this particular picture. He was 1836, died 1912. She was 1852, and she died 1909. And she was his student. She was 17 years old and he was something like 35. And these are her pictures. And this one I think is very charming. It's called Looking Out of the Window, and it's the 1890s. And she originally, as I say, was his student, and he had actually been married before. And at 17, she became a stepmother to his young children. And this is what this picture is about. And this is Always Welcome. She's actually painting one of her stepchildren there, and she's the one in bed. Interesting woman. Now, this is just to show you the difference in the incredible old-fashioned, they're still painting neo-classical. This one, believe it or not, it's Psyche before the throne of Venus, and it's a woman called Henrietta Ray. It was gigantic. It won all the prizes in the Royal Academy at the time, and it was sold for an enormous sum of money at the time, £1,200, which was a fortune. And it's been recently discovered in Texas. It's enormous. Now, this was 1894. The picture on the right, just to show you the difference that was going on in Europe, is Bert Morisot, and this is a summer's day of 1879. This picture was painted the year that Bert Morisot died. Look at the difference. This is how completely separated we were of what was going on in the rest of Europe. Okay, next one. This one I think is rather interesting. A watercolor again. The watercolors do seem to be interesting. This woman is called Rosa Barton, and she studied again. She studied in Brussels and in Paris, and she exhibited in the Royal Watercolor Society. Born in 1956, she died in 1929. But what is interesting is that it is a Charing Cross Bridge, and it was watercolor, and it was painted in 1894. And on the right, I put a Monet. Monet came to England to paint, stayed in the Savoy Hotel, did a series of something like enormous numbers, something like 30 of these. And this particular one is Charing Cross Bridge, all of Charing Cross Bridge, and it was 1899. So it's literally 4 years later than this rather nice picture by Mary Barton. I think it's fascinating because you can actually see the mud of the road. I gather the roads were in terrible state, and I'm walking on the side here, and all the carriages lined up on that side. It's an interesting thing. Okay, next one. This one is, I think, an extremely interesting and good painter. She's called Marianne Stokes, and she was Austrian. Her original name was Friedensberger, and she married Stokes, came to England. She was an Austrian painter. She was born in 1955. She died in 1957. But, you know, I talked about Newlyn before, and she became very much part of that Newlyn group of painters. She was trained in Munich, though, but she moved to Cornwall when she came here. And again, she showed at the Grafton Gallery. And she was really a continental artist rather more, although she lived in England for most of her, she died in England. And so therefore, again, I've put another Whistler, because Whistler was the only one really they were looking at. And this is a nocturne in blue and gold. It's Old Battersea Bridge of 1872. But this, I think, is an extremely interesting picture because it's the beginning of the railway. This is a contemporary painting. And that lovely red. It's a nice painting, this one. Now we see, actually, the sort of hero, or the place that's most important was the Slade School of Art. The Slade School of Art started in 1871. And what's important about it is that women and men were accepted as students. They had to wait for another sort of almost 50 years to be accepted as a student in the Royal Academy. But the Slades took the women. And this wonderful photograph here is 1905 of them in front of the Slade School. And there are a few men at the back, but mostly they're women. This is also the same year. And it's the Slade women students looking at their work on the wall. And very interestingly, 3 nudes. And these in the center, this is a woman called Eleanor Adams, and it's a female seated figure of 1906. And these photographs are 1905, so this is exactly the same time. This is later. This is a woman called Ida Knox, and this is a male figure painted at the Slade, but this is 1918, this is much later. But these two are roughly the same time, which I think is very interesting. Okay, next one. Now, here we're going to see the Johns. This is Augustus. You know about this. Augustus John was certainly, when I was an art student, was possibly the most famous figure in English painting. He had painted all the most important people. And it's a self-portrait here. Interestingly, both he and his sister were trained at the Slade. But the painting in the center, which is really rather a nice one, is W.B. Yeats. And these are painted. This is 1902, and this is 1907. And this is the drawing for that painting. He was very, very successful. But his sister, who was 2 years older than him, both of them at the Slade at the same time, was completely forgotten. She never, ever, ever made any sort of reputation in her lifetime. An interesting thing about Augustus, though, he was very fond of her. She died very, very sadly. She died in 1939, and she literally had an unknown grave. But he said, he actually foretold that we'd be looking at her work rather than his. And he's quite right. Okay, next two, and you'll see why. There's that wonderful, wonderful self-portrait. The same time as the self-portrait that he did. And this is 1902. And this is around about 1900. This is about 1900, the drawing. There you are. This tells you about him. And she was really, really extraordinary. Both of them, as you see, with the Slade. And she's, as you see, the only one of 16 women to exhibit among 75 men. And she had a very, very tragic life. She came to France, she left to France, and she fell madly in love with Rodin. And he was an awful man, really. And she sort of was She died absolutely poverty-stricken. They say she almost died of hunger. And the next one, she appeared, and this wonderful portrait here of her friend, with whom she went to France to begin with. She's called Chloe Barton Lee. And this was 1904, 1906. And the one on the right is her self-portrait with a letter to her brother of 1907. But isn't this a marvelous piece of painting? Look at this. Her work is so extraordinary. She talks about solitude and sadness in a way that I don't think anybody else does. For me, she always stood in for all the women who lost their husbands in the First World War. Okay, next one, she's a marvelous painter. Now, this lady is very interesting. She is very important. She's a suffragette. And I didn't know this, but she's actually wearing, in this painting, she's wearing the suffragette colours. The painting is by Ethel Wright, and the woman is Una Dugdale Duvall, it says so here. And she was a very important lady. She marched about, and these are the suffragette colours, and you see the cocks fighting in the background. It's very funny, this one. This particular was painted in 1912. And this is all the information about her. And she said she refused to promise to obey her husband. And this was a tremendous scandal in all the newspapers. When she married, she refused to obey her husband, which I think is very funny. Now, interestingly, the next lady is called Laura Knight. Now, why have I put on so much Laura Knight? For the very, very interesting reason that 150 years after the first two ladies were made members of the Royal Academy, she was the first woman, all that in 1936, to be made a member of the Royal Academy. And this picture here is a portrait of a girl's profile of 1896. It's a nice painting. And the center one is a watercolor. And she was very, very, very successful in her lifetime. What I didn't know until later was that she was the official artist sent by the government to the Nuremberg trials. I didn't know that until later. The middle one is a watercolor, and it's called A Bathing Pool. It's 1912. And the one is again, A Dark Pool by 1917. She was very, very, very successful and very important when I was a student. Okay, next one. Now, these people are very interesting. Now, what we're seeing now, the first time really English painting is even noticing what was happening abroad, because the person who is responsible for this loose brushwork and different intimate pictures of the world, the life, of course, was Sickert. And the top right is the Sickert portrait of the Camden Town murder of 1911. And he, of course, started his own school. And this particular lady, Ethel Sands, and her friend, who was called Nan Hudson, were students of his. One in the center is Ethel Sands, and it's tea with Sickert, and that is Sickert sitting on a chair, which is why we put a Sickert, the detail of Sickert. Now look at the paint quality, and look at the color particularly. And the one on the left is by Nan Hudson, and this is called the violin solo, and this is 1913, and this one is 1911-12. Now, these two ladies were lesbians, and they were they said so. This time, it appears that although homosexuality was against the law, lesbianism was not. And they were partner Nan Hudson actually was an American, but she lived all her life in England. And they lived together, and they became a sort of member of a group called the Fitzroy Group, which was very much involved with the Bloomsbury people. Okay, next one. This, I think, is a very interesting painting. It's by Sylvia Goss. She was again part of this group, and she was born in 1881, and she died in 1968. And look at the paint quality of this one. It's very, very like the others. It's very responsive. I mean, there's no doubt about it, Sickert. And this is called The Nurse of 1912. And she changes again because this one is the printer of 1915. She worked with Sickert and she became almost his assistant. And he died in moderate poverty in England, and she looked after him until he died. She worked with him, and at one time, there's no doubt about it, she was trained by him. But interestingly enough, also trained by Ford Madox Brown. All of these people that I've shown you were trained by Ford Madox Brown. And this one on the right was her painting in 1915. Now, what's happened, of course, in 1914 is the First World War. And this is a woman working as in the factory. Okay, next one. Now, here we've got the only examples of the Bloomsbury group I'm going to show. And this is Vanessa Bell. These are chrysanthemums and begonias and dahlias of 1912. And the other one is Still Life in the Corner of a Mantel Shelf of 1914. And of course, she was a sister of Virginia Woolf. But much more importantly, this is the first time that England is looking at all, their work is looking at all abroad. And of course, it's all dependent on Roger Fry, who brought the Manet and the Impressionists to England, to the exhibition, the famous exhibition of 1912. It took until 1912 for the British to even notice that Manet and the Impressionists had started. And what we're seeing here is the first time that the British are actually looking at anything that was being done on the continent. Next one. And this one is, I think, a much more interesting woman. It's called, as you see, Nina Hammett. Roger Fry seemed to go to bed with everybody because Vanessa Bell was one of his mistresses, as was Nina Hammett. But this is Still Life with Blue Jug, which I think is awfully interesting. And the other one is De Sturm. Why this is important is because it shows you that, again, they're looking in Europe, for example. Nina Hammett was 1890, died 1956, and she became very important part of the Bloomsbury group. And Roger Fry's dates are 1866 to 1934. And he really did create the title. He called the work Post-Impressionism, and he gave this exhibition first time in 1910, and then the big important one, Manet and the Post-Impressionists, in 1912. Now, interestingly, again, this is all to do with the Slade, because later on he taught art history at the Slade. Okay, next one. And this is women actually working in the man's world. This is the First World War. That woman I'd never heard of. She's called Anna Airy, Airy. And she again was a student of the Slade. And she was born in 1890. She died in 1903. And she was the first official woman war artist. And this particular picture is a shop for the machining 15-inch shells, and it took place in the Singer Manufacturing Company in Glasgow in 1918. And notice, they're all women working in the factory because the men were all busily fighting. Isn't that interesting? It's a very, 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 very confident painting, I think. It was actually painted in 1918. Okay, next one is, I think, very good. This is another one, the Armstrong works, you see. And she gets commissioned, as you see here, from the Imperial War Museum, which I think is interesting. Women have come about a little bit of input. Okay, next one. Now this was her again. This is a woman called Claire Atwood, and again, very, very firmly, she was painting for the War Office there. It's the Olympia in wartime, and it's the Royal Army clothing depot of 1918. And she was also a student of the Slade, and she was a member of the New English Art Club. But what is interesting, again, she was part of the group who were painting and got commissions from the Imperial War Museum. But she most importantly lived with these three people, and this is the house in which they lived, the terrace outside the priest's house, which is what it was called in Kent, in 1979. She died. Sorry, no, it can't be. Sorry, it's 1919. I can't read my own writing, because she actually died in 1962, and with her was a male, and they all lived in perfect harmony together, which is very strange at this time. And as I say, the sex between women was not illegal. Okay, next one. And there is a detail. You see. And she went in the name of Tony as well. And she had identified as a lesbian. And this is a young man. The little cat here, I think, is lovely. 1919. Okay. And this terrible one is the last picture that we see. And believe it or not, she was made a dame. Are you surprised? This is Dame Ethel Walker. She died in 1951. And of course, she became a member of the ARA. And it's called Nausicaa, and it's 1920. And this nude women, nurturing, they call it. It's absolutely dreadful. This is 1920. This is what England was painting in 1920. Okay, that's it. What do you think?